A bride was dropped at the mining camp. Cowboy rode all night to claim her. The letter came back unopened. I remember staring at it in the yard, my name crossed out in red ink, and the word refused stamped across the front in letters so hard they'd nearly cut through the envelope. I hadn't expected that. I'd expected a lot of things over the years: bad weather, broke horses, dry summers, the slow leak of men you trust turning out not to be. But I hadn't expected that particular word applied to a woman I'd written to honest as I knew how. I set it on the fence post and went back to work. That was March. By April, I'd put the whole idea out of my mind, or thought I had. I was running cattle up near the Cutter Range, staying in the line shack above Broken Creek, and I wasn't writing any more letters to any more agencies. I was 49 years old. I'd been alone since my wife Clara died, and that was 11 years gone. A man reaches a point where he stops auditioning for a life he's not sure he deserves. But Heck Dunmore rode out to the shack one morning while I was patching fence, and he had a look on his face like a man delivering bad news he's not sure is bad. He said, "You hear what happened over at the Calico?" I hadn't. I'd been up on the Cutter Range 5 days with nobody but a blue roan and my own company. Heck pulled up and leaned on his saddle horn the way he did when the story was going to take some time. He said a woman had come in on the stage the previous Thursday. Come in on the stage and nobody claimed her. The driver checked his manifest, and she was listed as a party belonging to one Rayfield Sode, who had sent for a mail-order bride out of a Cincinnati agency back in November, paid the deposit, and then promptly gotten himself killed in a shaft collapse at the Calico mine 3 weeks before she was due to arrive. The mine company, naturally, hadn't written to warn anybody. They hadn't written to the agency either. So the woman stepped off the stage in Harlow Flats with a trunk and a hat box and a letter of introduction to a dead man, and there was nobody there to meet her. I kept patching fence while Heck talked. I said, "What'd she do?" He said, "That's the thing. She's still there." I looked up at him. "Out at the Calico camp," he said. "The company gave her a room in the crew dormitory, the foreman's old office. They put a cot in it, and she's been there 6 days. Nobody quite knows what to do with her, and she doesn't have money enough to buy a stage ticket back east." I said, "What about the company?" Heck said they offered her work in the cook shack. I went back to the fence. I said, and she said no. I had to laugh at that, which surprised me. I hadn't laughed at much in a while. We didn't talk about it again. Heck rode on, and I stayed at the fence until dark, then went in and made coffee and sat with it and watched the fire burn low. I wasn't thinking about the woman exactly. I was thinking about the letter. The one that came back with refused on it. I was thinking how you could send something honest out into the world, and it still came back with that word on it, and what you did after. I went to sleep. I was awake by 2 in the morning, which wasn't unusual for me. What was unusual was that I couldn't go back to sleep. I lay there another hour, and then I gave up, got dressed, saddled the roan, and started riding south. I told myself I was heading into Harlow Flats on business. I had fence wire to buy. I told myself that for about the first 4 miles, and then I stopped lying. The Calico camp was 12 miles south of Broken Creek and another 6 east of Harlow Flats proper, sitting in a cut between 2 bare ridges where the wind came through sideways even in summer. I'd ridden past it before but never stopped. It wasn't the kind of place you stopped at if you didn't have to. Mining camps in that country had a particular flavor, not exactly lawless, but not exactly not, and the Calico had a reputation for hard men who drank hard and settled things in ways that left marks. I got there around first light. The camp was just starting to stir smoke coming up from the cook shack, a few men moving between the barracks and the latrine. The headframe over the main shaft stood black against the pink sky. I found the foreman, a man named Briggs Tolliver, eating breakfast outside the cook shack with 2 of his crew bosses. I tied the roan to the rail and walked up, and Tolliver looked at me the way men in his position always looked at men in mine, calculating, not quite hostile, waiting to see what I wanted. I said I was there about the woman. Tolliver set his fork down. He said, "What about her?" Not a question, just those 3 words, flat as a plank. I said I'd heard she was in some difficulty, and I'd ridden out to see if I could help. One of the crew bosses said something low to the other one that I wasn't meant to hear. Tolliver silenced him with a look, then turned back to me. He said, "She's not your concern. She came out here on a contract that ended when Soto died. Company's been more than decent putting a roof over her head." I said I was sure that was right, and I'd like to talk to her. Tolliver said, "She's not receiving visitors." I looked at him for a moment. He was a big man, Tolliver, wide through the shoulders, hands like shovels. He had the look of a man who'd got his way by being large for so long he'd stopped thinking about whether there were other ways. I said, "She's a woman alone in a mining camp. I'm not a visitor, I'm a neighbor." He didn't say anything to that. I said, "Point me to the foreman's office, and I'll be on my way soon enough." There was a pause that lasted long enough to be a thing of its own. Then Tolliver nodded toward a low building set apart from the main barracks near the south fence. He picked his fork back up. I went. The door of the office was plain wood, nothing on it, with a latch but no padlock. I knocked twice and waited. Nothing. I knocked again and said through the door, "My name is Walt Cutter. I run cattle up on the Cutter Range. I'm not from the mine and I don't work for Tolliver. I heard about your situation and I rode out this morning. I'd like to talk to you if you're willing." Silence for long enough that I was preparing to leave. Then the latch lifted, and the door opened 6 inches, and I got my first look at her. She was maybe 35, though hard to be sure. Her face was tight and careful the way a face gets when it's been on guard for a while. Brown hair pulled back, dark circles under her eyes that said she hadn't slept much in 6 days either. She was wearing a gray traveling dress that had been neat once, but had the look of clothes that have been lived in longer than intended. She looked at me the way you'd look at something that might be a trap. I said, "I'm not here to make anything harder for you." She said, "What are you here for?" Direct, no wasted words. I appreciated that. I said, "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. I heard about your situation and it sat wrong with me and I rode down to see." She looked at me for another moment, then stepped back from the door. Not quite an invitation, but not a refusal either. I went in. The room was what it was: a cot, a trunk, a small table, a lamp turned down low against the morning light coming through the single window. A book open face down on the table, her hat box in the corner. The room had the feel of a place a person was very carefully not making themselves at home in. She sat on the edge of the cot. I stayed by the door. I said, "How much trouble are you in?" She said, "I'm not in trouble." I said, "I don't mean it that way. I mean practically. Money, what you're going to do." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have $11.40, enough for maybe 3 days of food and not enough for a stage ticket anywhere worth going." I said, "You have family back east." She said, "Not that I'd go back to." That was all she said about it, and I didn't push. I said, "They treating you all right here?" She said, "They're treating me like a problem they're trying to politely ignore until I solve myself." I said, "That matches what I was told." She looked at me with those careful eyes. She said, "You rode out here at dawn. That's a considerable effort for a stranger." I said, "I'm a light sleeper." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile but close. She said, "I'm Margaret Ames." I said, "Walt Cutter." We shook hands, which felt formal and also right. Her handshake was firm, which told me something. I said, "The town of Harlow Flats is 6 miles west. Small, but there's a boarding house run by a woman named Doris Pratt who doesn't charge more than his fare. I can take you there today if you want." She said, "And then what?" I said, "That's up to you." She sat for a moment looking at the floor. Then she said, "Mr. Cutter, what exactly do you want from this, from coming out here?" It was a fair question. It deserved a fair answer. I said, "Nothing that you don't want to give." She looked at me. I said, "I sent a letter to a placement agency 8 months back. It came back refused. I don't know what I did wrong in it. But I'm a man who has a place and a steady living and nobody to share it with. And when I heard about your situation, I couldn't sleep, and so I got on my horse. That's the whole of it." She sat with that for a long time, long enough that I started thinking about whether I should say something else or stay quiet. I stayed quiet. Then she said, "The letter that was refused, what did you say in it?" I said I tried to be honest, maybe too honest. I said I was 49, and I'd been widowed 11 years, and I ran a cattle operation that turned a modest profit, and had a house that needed work, and that I was a hard man to know, but I'd try to be a decent one. I said I didn't have a lot of soft in me, but I had steady. She said, that's a good letter. I said someone disagreed. She said someone was wrong. The way she said it was simple, quiet, not consoling, just stating a fact as she saw it. It landed harder than anything consoling would have. I looked at the floor for a moment. Then I said, I can get your trunk tied to the roan. It'll take me 20 minutes. She said, yes, all right. That was all she said. She stood up, looked around the room once like she was confirming she hadn't left anything of herself there that she'd miss, and picked up her book from the table and put it in her bag. I went out to deal with the trunk. Tolliver found me in the yard before I'd taken 4 steps. He came around the corner of the barracks with his 2 crew bosses behind him, moving in that way that men move when they've decided something ahead of time. The yard was open ground between the buildings. A few other men had drifted to the edges without looking like they were watching. He said, she's under the mine company's care until she makes other arrangements. I said, she's made other arrangements. He said, I haven't been informed of that. I said, you're being informed now. Tolliver stopped about 10 feet from me. He was the same big man he'd been at breakfast, maybe a little wider in the chest from where he'd drawn himself up. He said, the stage comes through Thursday. She can leave Thursday. I said, she'll leave this morning. He said, not with you she won't. There was a particular kind of quiet that descended on that yard. The kind of quiet that happens when men have shifted from talking to something else. I've been in those moments before. You don't think ahead in them, not really. You take them one breath at a time. I said, Mr. Tolliver, I want you to think carefully about what you're proposing here. You're proposing to prevent a woman with no ties to your company from leaving with a man she's chosen to leave with. Think about how that reads. Think about who you'd have to be to do that. He said, I'd be doing what the company. I said, the company doesn't own her. Quiet again. Behind me, I heard the door of the office open. I didn't turn around. I heard her footsteps cross the threshold and stop somewhere just behind me and to my left. She said, I'd like my trunk brought out, please. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to Tolliver. Her voice was even as a board. Tolliver looked at her, and then at me, and then back at her. Something in him shifted. I could see it. The way a man's face changes when he's done a calculation, and the number came out different than he expected. He said, I'll have a man bring it. Nobody said anything else. One of the crew bosses went to get the trunk. I didn't relax exactly, but the particular tightness in the yard loosened enough to breathe through. We were out of the camp inside 30 minutes. The roan was a patient horse, good enough to carry the trunk and make decent time. Margaret Ames walked beside me on the road to Harlow Flats, and we didn't talk much for the first mile. The morning had come up clear and cool, the kind of cool that burns off fast in that country, and the ridges were still throwing long shadows across the road. She said, did you think he was going to let us leave? I said, wasn't sure. She said, were you afraid? I thought about it. I said, careful, not afraid. She said, what's the difference? I said, afraid is thinking about what can go wrong. Careful is thinking about what to do next. She thought about that, then she said, I was afraid. I said, that's sensible. You didn't know how it was going to go. She said, neither did you. I said, true enough. After a while she said, what's the house like, your house? I said, needs work, good bones. She said, what kind of work? I said, south window needs replacing. Kitchen wants a proper floor, it's packed dirt right now. Roof over the back bedroom isn't level. Porch rail on the east side rotted out 2 winters ago, and I haven't replaced it. She said, that's quite a list. I said, it is. She said, do you have a kitchen garden? I said, I did when Clara was alive. It's all gone to grass now. She was quiet, then she said, I know how to put a garden back. I said, I figured you might. We walked on. The road curved south along a dry creek bed, and the roan's hooves made their steady sound on the packed earth. She said, I'm not easy to live with. I said, neither am I. She said, I need things to be straight with me. I don't manage well with things left sideways. I said, I'm not a sideways man. She said, you barely know me. I said, I know you stood on the other side of that door for a good long while, and you opened it anyway. And I know you walked out of that yard with your back straight when you had every reason not to. She didn't say anything to that. We got to Harlow Flats around mid-morning. I set her up at Doris Pratt's boarding house and paid 2 weeks ahead out of my own pocket, which I told Doris was a loan to Miss Ames to be repaid when convenient. I did not ask Margaret's permission to do this. She watched me do it and didn't protest. When we were done and the trunk was in her room and I was getting ready to ride back up to Broken Creek, she came out to the front steps of the boarding house, and I was standing in the road with the roan. She said, "Will you come back?" I said, "Yes." She said, "When?" I said, "Saturday." She said, "All right." Then she said, "Thank you, Walt." She used my name. I don't know why that hit me like it did. 11 years of being called Cutter or Mr. Cutter or Hey You by everyone except a few people who mattered, and she said my name like it was a natural thing, like she'd been using it a while. I rode back up to Broken Creek and did not sleep that night either, but this time for different reasons. Saturday I came down in cleaner clothes and with my hat brushed, which my horse seemed to find suspicious. We took a walk along the creek east of town. She had changed into a blue dress that was better suited to where she actually was than the traveling clothes, and she looked like someone who was starting to make peace with her surroundings. She asked me about the cattle operation, actual questions, not polite ones, how many head, what range, how I moved them in winter, what the trouble years had been. I told her, all of it. The drought year of 77 that killed 30 head before I could move them to higher ground. The year the creek flooded and took out the south fence twice in one season. The winter I spent with a bad leg and couldn't get to the north pasture for 6 weeks, and lost money I was years getting back. She listened the way some people listen, like she was building something in her mind out of what I told her. She said, "You've had some real hard years." I said, "Ranching's a hard business." She said, "You're still at it." I said, "I am." She looked out at the creek for a moment and then back at me. She said, "The agency that sent the letter back, which one was it?" I told her. She said, "I registered with that agency in September. I was sent to Mr. Soto in November." She paused. "I wonder if you and I were in their files at the same time." I said, "That's something to think about." She said, "It is." We walked back to town and I stayed for supper at the boarding house. Doris Pratt cooked for her boarders. And after supper, Margaret and I sat on the porch while the light went down and the air cooled and the first stars came out over the ridge to the east. She said, "Tell me about Clara." Most women wouldn't ask that. Most women would let it be a closed room, Margaret asked. I told her how we'd met, how she'd been, what she was like in the mornings, how she'd died, the fever that came on fast and didn't stop, 5 days from the first sign to the last, how the house had felt after. Margaret listened to all of it. When I was done, she said, "She sounds like she was worth grieving." I said, 11 years of it. She said, "How long before you stopped?" I said, "I'm not sure I have. I just learned to carry it different." She said, "That's honest." I said, "I try to be." She said, "I know." The porch was quiet for a while. Somewhere down the street, a door closed. A dog barked twice and stopped. She said, "What do you want, Walt? From all of this, say it plain." I looked at her. "A partner," I said. "Someone I can count on and who can count on me. Someone to sit with at the end of the day. Someone who chooses to be there and stays." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I choose carefully." I said, "I know, that's why I'm asking." She looked out at the dark for a while. Then she said, "The kitchen floor packed dirt." I said, "That's right." She said, "That's the first thing." I said, "I'll buy the lumber this week." We were married in Harlow Flats in June. Doris Pratt stood up for Margaret, and a man named Olin Carey, who ran the feed store and had known me 15 years, stood up for me. The preacher was Harlow Flats's preacher, who was a compact, brisk man who got through the ceremony in 11 minutes, which suited all of us. We drove back up to the place in the wagon I'd borrowed from Olin. The roan was tied to the back and moving easy in the afternoon heat. Margaret sat beside me on the bench with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the road ahead, and for a long way neither of us said anything. Then she said, "Tell me about the south window." I said, "The frame's rotted on one side. I've been putting off pulling it out." She said, "We can do it this week." I said, "All right." She said, I'll hold the frame while you pull the nails. I said, it'll be heavy. She said, Walt. I said, right. We drove on. The ridge came into view, and then the house below it, and I watched her take it in the shape of it, the lean of the porch rail, the gap where the back shed wanted its door replaced. She looked at it the way she'd listened to me talking, like she was making something out of what she saw. She said, it's a good house. I said, it will be. She looked at me and said, it already is. There was something in how she said it, not flattery, not reassurance. Just her seeing something clearly and saying what she saw, the way she did. I'd been at that place 11 years trying to keep it up enough that it didn't embarrass me, doing the minimum to hold it from falling over, and she looked at it for 60 seconds and saw something I hadn't been able to see. I pulled the wagon up to the front and set the brake. She climbed down before I could get around to help her, which I'd already figured out was who she was, and she walked up to the porch and put her hand on the rail that still stood and looked back at me in the late afternoon light. She said, come on then. So I did. That first year is something I carry whole. The window, we pulled it out on a Tuesday, and she held the frame, and I pulled the nails, and she was right that she could hold it even though I'd said it would be heavy. The kitchen floor took 3 weeks because I kept running cattle while we worked. But by the end of August it was laid and level, and she put a piece of oilcloth on it that she'd bought in Harlow Flats that had a blue pattern on it, and that floor has been solid for 7 years now. The garden she started in September of that first year, late for most things, but she knew what she was doing, and by the following spring it was producing. She planted things I hadn't thought to plant, dill, because she said eggs needed it, which I didn't know, and the kitchen smelled different after that. Better. She learned the cattle. She didn't need to, it was my work, and she had enough of her own. But she wanted to know it, and so I taught her, and she turned out to have a patience with animals that I respected. She could gentle a nervous horse with a quiet I didn't have. The men from town, the ones who'd known me when I was alone, they'd ride out now and find her at the fence line or in the yard, and they were always slightly surprised, every time, like they kept forgetting she was there. Like they'd gotten so used to Walt Cutter being a man you felt a little sorry for that they couldn't quite update the picture. I noticed that. I didn't say anything about it, but I noticed. One evening in the fall of that first year, Olin Carey came out for supper, and after, when Margaret had gone inside, he sat with me on the porch and we had a smoke, and he said, Walt, I never thought I'd see you like this. I said, like what? He said, easy. I thought about that word. I said, is that what it looks like? He said, like a man who's put something down he'd been carrying a long time. I didn't say anything to that. I watched the light on the ridge and smoked my cigarette. Then Margaret came to the door and said Olin's coffee was ready, and we went inside. She's not a soft woman. I want to be clear about that, because the word soft gets attached to wives in a way that doesn't fit her and wouldn't fit what she'd once said. She is particular and direct, and she has opinions that she will tell you whether you asked or not, and she cannot stand a thing left half done. It doesn't matter if it's a fence or a sentence, she'll want you to finish it. There was a man in town in the second year, a man named Creel who had some loose business to settle with me from before Margaret came. Money owed me from a cattle deal that he kept finding reasons not to pay. He'd been avoiding me for 18 months. One afternoon Margaret ran into him at the dry goods store and I wasn't there. And by the time I heard about it, she had laid out the whole situation to him in plain terms and informed him that the money was expected by Friday. And if it wasn't forthcoming, she'd be happy to lay the matter before the judge who came through on the first Thursday of each month. Creel paid on Thursday. I didn't know whether to be irritated or impressed, so I landed on impressed. I said, you didn't have to do that. She said, you've been carrying that for 18 months. I said I could have handled it. She said, I know you could, and I did. I looked at her. She was standing at the stove, not looking at me, stirring something. I said, thank you. She said, you'd have done the same. I said, I would have. She said, I know. That's how things mostly went with us. Not a lot of ceremony. She knew what I'd do, and I knew what she'd do, and we mostly didn't have to explain ourselves to each other, which is the particular luxury of a person you've figured out. The winter of the third year was the hardest one I'd had since Clara died. A bad cold came down in November, and I pushed through it because the cattle needed moving and there was nobody else. And I pushed through it too long, and by December I was in bed with something that had settled in my chest and wouldn't shift. Margaret did not make a fuss about it. This is not how it sounds. She cared. She was there. She sat with me through the bad nights and brought food I couldn't eat and changed the cloth on my forehead without being asked and without making it a thing. But she didn't weep over me or speak in the careful voice people use around the very sick, the voice that tells you they're already imagining the funeral. She spoke to me like a man who was going to get up. Like his getting up was a matter of logistics and she was working out the logistics. She said to me one of those nights when I was at the low point of it, when I was genuinely not certain whether I was going to come out the other side. She was sitting in the chair beside the bed, and she had my hand and she said, "Walt, I need you to keep fighting. Not I'll lose you or I can't do this without you." She said I need you to keep fighting, like she was giving me a job. Like she believed I was the kind of man who would do a job he was assigned. That's the kind of woman she is. I kept fighting. By January I was up. By February I was back on the horse. There's a thing that happened in the spring of the 4th year. We were coming back from Harlow Flats on a Saturday afternoon, early spring. The light, that particular thin gold color it gets when the season is just deciding to change. She was beside me on the wagon bench and we were talking about something. The fence on the north side, I think, or the price of feed, one of the regular things. And I looked over at her, and she was looking down the road with that particular attention she had, and the light was on the side of her face, and I thought, clear as a spoken word, I do not deserve this. Not in a sorry way, not a complaint, just the plain truth of it, that I was a hard man and a weathered one, and I had been alone a long time, and this woman was here beside me on this bench choosing to be here, and I didn't know what I had done to be the man she'd chosen. I said, "Margaret." She looked at me. I said, "How'd you end up with me?" She looked at me for a moment with the neutral expression that meant she was deciding how serious a question it was. Then she said, "You came and got me." I said, "That's it." She said, "You rode out in the dark to a mining camp because you heard a woman was in a bad spot. You didn't know me. You didn't know if I'd even open the door. You brought me out and got me safe and paid 2 weeks at Doris Pratt's and then showed up Saturday like you said you would." She looked back at the road. "That's not nothing." I said, "Anybody would've." She said, "Walt." I said, "What?" She said, "Nobody else did." I looked at the road. The horse moved on at its steady walk. The air had that first hint of warmth in it that means winter is finally giving up. She said, "You're not a complicated man to understand, once you know what to look for." I said, "What do you look for?" She said, "Whether they do what they say they'll do." I said, "And?" She said, "And you do." She put her hand on my arm, not a dramatic gesture, just a hand on an arm the way you'd touch something that's been yours for a while, easy and sure. She was looking at the road. We drove the rest of the way home like that. The porch rail on the east side, the one that had been rotted out when she came, we replaced it together in the fall of the 2nd year, a Saturday afternoon when the work was light. She held the posts while I set the footings, and she was right again about being able to hold them, and we had the new rail up by late afternoon. She ran her hand along it when we were done, checking for splinters. Found one, sanded it down, ran her hand along it again. She said, "Good." I said, "You're particular." She said, "Things should be done right." I said, "Yes, they should." She looked at me. She had sawdust on her sleeve and on her cheek, and she didn't know about the one on her cheek, and I didn't tell her because she looked right. She said, "What are you looking at?" I said, "My wife." She held my look for a moment, then she turned and went inside. 7 years, the house is right now, or near enough. The kitchen floor has been solid since that 1st year. The south window is tight, the porch rail stands, the garden is full. I put the back bedroom roof level in the 3rd year, and it's held through 2 hard winters. She's at the table right now as I'm thinking about all this, reading, the lamp pulled close because the light goes early this time of year. She has her hair loose, which she only does at home. Her coffee is going cold beside her because she forgets it when she's reading, which is one of the things about her that I will never mention because some things are not worth mentioning. I was a man living alone for 11 years in a house that needed work, running cattle, carrying something I had no name for and had stopped trying to name. I sent a letter that came back refused. I couldn't sleep. I got on my horse. I don't know exactly what that adds up to in the accounting of a life. I know that she's at the table, and the lamp is lit, and the floor is solid, and the rail on the porch will be there in the morning. That's what I know. That's enough.